There is a clear truth in the New Testament. Christians should not keep the law.
I'm going there to see my Savior, who shed for me his precious blood.
I realize that this is a controversial statement, and most Christians will take issue with it. However, I just think it's impossible to read the epistles of Paul and reach any other honest conclusion. The degree of twisting and wrangling that is necessary to substantiate any other interpretation is nothing more than dismissive revisionism. Those who use Paul's statements as proof texts to promote keeping the law are not only reading something into it that doesn't exist, they're refusing to acknowledge what their own lying eyes tell them does exist. The Christian emancipation from the law is the primary point of Romans, Galatians, and Hebrews. Those that promote the law would be more honest if they simply rejected those writings outright or relegated them to a pseudo-inspired category, like others have done historically with the Epistle of James. They're already doing that anyway in their own mind. They just don't have the intellectual honesty to admit it. The quantity and quality of clear statements by Paul declaring the law to not be a Christian institution is overwhelming. He declares it and explains it in every possible way imaginable, at times even serially, in multiple chain statements, pounding the point home for those that will never be convicted of the crime of subtlety or the sin of nuance. But not only are there scores of such statements, but the logical structure of those writings are also organized to be powerful statements against the incorporation of the law into Christianity. So we see statements like, not of works, lest anyone should boast, or not by works of righteousness, which we have done, are not just simple, convenient proofs. They're the brightest feathers woven into a full-length regal war bonnet against legalism. This is why those that teach that Christians should obey the law are adverse to providing meaningful exegesis of these texts in full. All they're able to do is artificially redefine the words and contort the sentences to such a degree that Paul seems to have been writing his epistles from bizarro world, where everything is the exact opposite of what it is. Many defend this approach, pointing to statements made by Jesus, James, or the prophets. They reason that it isn't possible for Paul to contradict Jesus, and since they're more than 100% certain that they understand Jesus perfectly, Paul must be revised to fit that understanding. Now, in reality, this has nothing to do with what they have learned from Jesus, James, Peter, or the prophets. They've already made up their mind that keeping the law makes sense, and hence the Bible is to be shoehorned into that ideology. To their credit, their reasoning is straightforward. It goes like this. The Ten Commandments are the eternal moral law of God. So how could they not be binding on all people? However, this is question begging. What evidence is there that the Ten Commandments are eternal or moral? Much less the eternal moral law of God. Now don't misunderstand. I'm not suggesting that the Ten Commandments or any of the law of Moses are immoral. I'm simply pointing out that the moral appellation of the Ten Commandments is both inaccurate and conveniently contrived. How are the Ten Commandments distinguished in such a fashion? They're never called this. Not by Moses, not by the prophets, not by Jesus, not by the apostles. And there's no implicit evidence for this designation either. The laws of the Ten Commandments are not significantly more moral than many of the other Mosaic laws, and certainly not more so than the many enjoinders found in the New Testament. Consider the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus colorfully says, and I paraphrase, "You've heard old people say, 'Do not kill.' Well, I'm telling you, do not be unreasonably angry." Many assume that because they've been told so, that the Sermon on the Mount is the proper interpretation of the law of Moses. But Jesus did not fine-tune that law. Rather, he trumped that law with a superior law of his own. He says regarding the common understanding of Moses' law regarding hating your enemies, that he commanded instead that we're to love them. On the Mosaic law and divorce, he was ruthless. He bluntly declared that Moses had issued a substandard law out of pragmatic rationality, but that it was not according to God's will or God's design. And then he confirmed the conclusion of the experts of the law that the greatest commandments weren't even mentioned in the 10 Commandments. Love God and love your neighbor. All this, and we haven't even gotten to Paul's demolition of the Old Testament law as a viable substructure for New Testament doctrine and practice. Consider the low-hanging fruit first. Paul warns us away from the works of the flesh: adultery, fornication, uncleanness, lasciviousness, idolatry, witchcraft, hatred, variance, emulations, wrath, strife, seditions, heresies, envyings, murders, drunkenness, and revelings. Notice that almost none of these are found in the 10 Commandments, neither explicitly nor even implicitly. The degree of spiritualization required to find these in the Decalogue is worthy of an Oscar for Best Adapted Screenplay. Also notice that this isn't even a complete list. You can almost see Paul panting and out of breath. So finally he just ends it saying, "and such like." Meaning, this is not to be seen as an enumerated list of sins, but a sampling of what sin looks like. And now notice how redundant the list is. Whereas the 10 Commandments have almost no redundancy at all. The works of the flesh have 4 varieties of sexual sin: adultery, fornication, uncleanness, lasciviousness. 3, maybe 4 varieties of doctrinal error: idolatry, witchcraft, seditions, heresies. At least 2 varieties of intemperance, drunkenness, and revelings. And 6 varieties of interpersonal relationship sins: hatred, variance, emulation, wrath, strife, and envy. Almost none of these are outlawed anywhere in the law of Moses, and certainly not in the supposed eternal moral law of the 10 Commandments. But finally notice that no reference or allusion is made to any portion of the Decalogue in this text, except when he says of the fruit of the Spirit that there is no law concerning such things. But as I said, this was just some of the low-hanging fruit. For those looking to really dig into Paul's theology concerning the law, I direct you to his seminal treatise on the subject, Romans. However, since most of you are probably proficient in the more obvious portions, let's just skip that book and look at some of the less well-known arguments in other of his writings. A particular favorite of mine is his 3-pronged evisceration of the Mosaic law in Galatians. It goes something like this. First, the law of Moses was at best an interim covenant. Second, for the Gentile believer, the law of Moses is practically equivalent to paganism. And third, God disavows all personal association with the law of Moses. Now granted, these points are not to be found spelled out in the type of proof text that evangelicals are so fond of. But even a precursory exegetical reading of the epistle draws them right to the surface. The first statement is the most apparent. Paul implies that the law was not eternal, but rather that it was added as a response to sin, and its role was that of our schoolmaster, our tutor, our governor, until the time appointed by the Father. The second statement is implied when he admonishes the Galatians that their desire to be under the law was the practical equivalent of returning to their former bondage of paganism. And the third statement is driven home when he allegorizes the law as Hagar and Ishmael, and God casting out the bondwoman, refusing to recognize her child as his son of promise. So Paul, why don't you tell us what you really think? It's no wonder that the Jews considered Paul their mortal enemy and a traitor to his people. Another out-of-the-way dismantling of the law is found in 2 Corinthians 3. This is particularly important because in the broader context of this text, it doesn't even deal with the law or grace, which illustrates how committed and concerned Paul was with this issue. He explains that the true evidence, both of his own ministry as well as their faith, was the new covenant written in their mutual hearts with the Spirit of God. And then he just can't help himself But then he points out the juxtaposition of this new covenant with the one graven on stone tablets. Now, this text is fascinating in part because he leaves no wriggle room for those that believe that the Ten Commandments are still binding. While in Romans, Galatians, Ephesians, and even Colossians, there's some degree of plausible deniability. I mean, if you really strain, you can make out the tiniest of crevices in his arguments that can be exploited to legitimize the view that what Paul really meant to say was that we are under the law, just not the ceremonial law, or the dietary law, or the Levitical law, or the fourth commandment of the 10 or 9 commandments, but definitely under the law. But such isn't the case in 2 Corinthians 3, where Paul explicitly and inextricably links his arguments to the stone tablets themselves, the 10 Commandments. And what does he proclaim? That while they were glorious in their day, that day not only has already passed, but it was already passing from the very moment they were delivered from on Sinai. The glory of the 10 Commandments was due to the lack of competitive comparisons. With each passing day, they shrank into the shadow of the awesome power and hope of the ever-approaching new covenant, until the point that that which was glorious above all other covenants of their time had been reduced to a mere bureaucracy of death. This astounding contrast is so clear that only those whose hearts are blinded can possibly fail to see that the law is abolished in Christ. What could it hurt to keep the law, some plead, as like a middle ground between keeping the law and abolishing the law? They're unmoved by Paul's intractableness in Jerusalem. No, not for an hour, he says. But Paul, what could it hurt to circumcise Titus? I mean, it could hurt Titus, but what could it hurt? Circumcision is nothing. Uncircumcision is nothing but the keeping of the laws of God. No, not for an hour. Why such vehemence, Paul? That the truth of the gospel might continue with you. Keeping the law is much more than eschewing sin and embracing righteousness. It is subjecting oneself to the sovereignty of the covenant itself. The 10 Commandments are the old covenant. To keep them is to show allegiance to it. A Christian has no more right or duty to keep the articles of the instrument of that alien covenant than an American has to keep the laws and constitution of a foreign nation. Overlap between the prohibitions and enjoinders of the old and the new does not mean that the new creature is subject to the old covenant. This servile dissimulation in deferring to the law of the Old Testament is obscenely disrespectful of the design of the New Testament. Is the covenant written by the Spirit in our hearts so incomplete and so crippled that we need to import the same graven stone law whose glory did not last a single day? If that's the case, then this new covenant is a complete sham. It doesn't even have its own stipulations regarding the most basic forms of human interaction. The notion that absent the keeping of the Old Testament law, we're lawless and licensed to sin is to imply that the New Testament does not make any independent or unique demand in our hearts, even for the most elementary form of righteousness. Does the New Testament not legislate on paganism, idolatry, blasphemy, insubordination, murder, adultery, theft, false witness, and covetousness? Of course it does, and in far finer detail than could be possible with a law chiseled onto a stone tablet. The law of the New Testament is not only deeper than the 10 Commandments, it's broader and higher. Under the Mosaic law, the name of the game was the letter of the law. The object of the game was to satisfy the adjudicators of the law that its requirements had been met. The play was loopholes, technicalities, and extenuating circumstances. And some, like Paul, were legal grandmasters. Now others, like that poor hapless fool picking up sticks on Inauguration Day, well, not so much. But the New Testament overturned the table and sent all the pieces flying. It inscribed righteousness itself onto the hearts of the believer. He is now his own judge and jury. No amount of persuading others matters anymore. If all the spectators of his life say he's righteous, it makes no difference. His own heart condemns him. There are no loopholes. There are no technicalities. There are no extenuating circumstances that can make right what a believer's own heart condemns as evil. The 10 Commandments declare, "Thou shalt not commit adultery." But when our heart is alive in the new covenant, we are convicted of every shade and variation of lasciviousness, even those we don't have names for or even know exist. The 10 Commandments say nothing of lying, pornography, sacrilege, indifference, malice, lust, and an infinite number of other sins. But the new covenant speaks clearly and unavoidably on every one. When the glory of the New Testament pierces the veil of our mind, revealing the frailty of the Old Covenant, we will understand the disgust of Paul when he posits that the Galatians' foray into the law was them falling from grace. We do not need the 10 Commandments to be righteous. And the 10 Commandments, or any law for that matter, are not righteousness. At best, they're meta-righteousness. In other words, they're a description of righteousness, but not even a complete description, nor an exclusive description, nor a sufficient description, nor even a necessary description. It's possible to keep all the law and not be righteous. It's possible to know nothing of the law and be righteous. This is the conclusion of the first 2 chapters of Romans. If we ask how many commandments are required to completely, sufficiently, and exclusively define righteousness, the answer most assuredly is not 10. It's not 100. It's not even 618. It's not 1,000,000. Whatever quantity might be proposed, it at least falls short by 1. Can always find one more. Hence, we find that the righteousness of the New Testament is not a meta-righteousness like the law of righteousness that Israel followed after but was unable to attain. By faith, we attain to righteousness itself. It is not the shadow cast by the light, as it is said of the Old Testament. Rather, the New Testament is the very light itself. The common diatribe against the primacy and sufficiency of the New Testament is that without the law of Moses, we become lawless and licentious. However, having the law has never resulted in anyone being lawful, except maybe in self-identification. Those given the law broke the law the first day and every day after that. Now, the law is not bad, but the end result is the same. The law is weak and ineffective. Why would we incorporate into a covenant that works the very substance of the old covenant that never worked? How is it that making anyone more righteous and not just simply making them self-righteous? Are the true sons of God with the unction of the Spirit in their hearts really being restrained by the 6th commandment, thou shalt not kill? And if not, why do they insist on pretending that they are keeping it? We do not keep the law. We attain to righteousness by faith. We don't work to be righteous. We are righteous, not by works, but by imputation. And we don't just begin by faith, we live by faith. The reason Christians sin has nothing to do with the law or not keeping the law. Most of the sins committed by Christians are not even addressed in the law. And regardless, more law has never and will never result in less sin. The law is the knowledge of sin. It's not the undoing of sin. It's the awareness of sin. It's certainly not the death of sin. What impels a Christian to righteousness is righteousness itself in their hearts. The innumerable, indivisible, indescribable, true righteousness of God imputed to us by grace, which transforms our desires. The ignorant object that such a doctrine means that a Christian can do anything he wants. Okay, well, that's true. And it's not only true of Christians, but that categorically misses the point. Grace has nothing to do with being able to do whatever you want. You can already do that anyway. Grace is the power to want to do what you should. And there is no law that can compete with that power. So why would we follow after such weak and beggarly elements?
I'll soon be free from every trial, and this from will rest beneath the side.